around 270 drones. That is roughly what Ukraine launched in a single night over the Azov Sea on July 11, 2026. The bill for those drones, even at generous estimates, runs somewhere between a few $100,000 and $2 million total. What they destroyed that night? 28 vessels, tankers, tugboats, cargo ships. Represents assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars in replacement value. Insured under policies that no underwriter will renew, crewed by sailors who will not be going back out. This is not a story about one spectacular strike. It is a story about a rate of exchange so lopsided that it has ceased to function as military economics and started functioning as something closer to arithmetic humiliation. 28 ships in a single night, 76 vessels over 6 days, one every hour for hours at a time. How did a country with no surface navy and no coastal artillery close an entire inland sea to Russian shipping? And what does it mean that nobody in Moscow appears to have had a plan for when this happened? The answers require understanding not just what Ukraine struck, but why those targets were there in the first place, and why they were so exposed when the drones arrived. Begin with the geography of Russia's problem in the south. The R-280 highway, the primary overland route running from Rostov-on-Don down toward Crimea, has been under sustained Ukrainian long-range pressure since the early stages of the full-scale war. Bridges in the northern approaches to the peninsula were hit repeatedly. Convoys using the road operated under persistent threat. The overland route never became completely impassable, but the risk and the cost of using it escalated continuously. Russian planners, facing the need to sustain a large military force on the peninsula while also maintaining civilian infrastructure and export operations, shifted an increasing share of the logistical burden onto the sea. Tankers carried refined fuel products south toward the Kerch Peninsula. Cargo vessels moved grain and general supplies through the Kerch Strait. The Azov Sea, shallow, enclosed, familiar, became the backbone of Russia's southern supply chain. It was also, from a Ukrainian planning perspective, a nearly perfect target environment. The Azov is small. Its longest axis runs roughly 370 kilometers. Its depth averages around 7 meters, which limits the class of vessel that can operate there and concentrates traffic into predictable corridors. Unlike the open Black Sea, where a surface drone must cover vast distances and navigate around active naval patrol routes, the Azov offers shorter approach distances, more confined geometry, and, critically, no significant Russian surface fleet capable of intercepting incoming threats. The Black Sea Fleet, based in Sevastopol, had spent 2 years absorbing Ukrainian maritime drone and missile strikes of its own. Frigates, landing ships, a submarine, a flagship, all struck. Some sunk, the rest pulled back. The vessels capable of escorting Azov cargo runs were either unavailable or deemed too valuable to risk in open water. The tugboats and tankers moving through the Azov were, in the most literal sense, unescorted. Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, units identified in operational reporting as Kairos, Taki, Madar, K2, and the 1st Center Raid Nemesis, had been developing and refining maritime drone capability for years before the Azov campaign accelerated. The primary platform, the Magura series and its variants, evolved through operational experience into a vehicle capable of carrying approximately 200 kilograms of payload at surface level, with a radar cross-section small enough to complicate interception, and a guidance system resilient enough to function in the electronic warfare environment Russia has deployed throughout the theater. The newest variant represents something closer to a conventional munition than the improvised craft that first demonstrated the concept. At 200 kilograms of payload, it is not a nuisance weapon. It is a ship killer. On the night of July 11th, 270 of them went out. Zoom in for a moment to a single vessel somewhere in the Azov that night. Footage released by Russian sailors themselves, filmed on deck, posted to social media, apparently without any sense of how comprehensively it documented their situation, shows the moment the strikes began. You can hear the drones before you can see them, a characteristic of surface skimming platforms that keeps them below the visible horizon until the last moments. The sailor filming does not move. He watches. On the adjacent vessel, maybe 300 meters away, the water erupts. Then another vessel, then another. The glass behind him cracks from the concussion. He keeps filming. There is no panic in the footage, but there is something that reads as a kind of cognitive collapse. The inability to process an event that falls outside every category of experience a merchant sailor would have trained for. He was not a combatant. He was crew on a tanker moving fuel across an inland sea. The war had not until that moment been something that happened to him personally. By the time the night ended, 28 ships had been struck. The cumulative 6-day tally stood at 76 vessels, 21 tankers, 4 tugboats, 2 dry cargo ships, 1 special-purpose vehicle, and others. The tugboats are worth dwelling on specifically. Ukraine's drone operators were not only striking the primary targets, they were striking the rescue response. When damaged tankers radioed for assistance and tugs were dispatched to tow them to port, those tugs were hit on arrival. The message encoded in that choice is not subtle. There is no safe zone within the operational range of these drones, and coming to the aid of a struck vessel is an act of equal exposure. Russian maritime operators in the Azov were not facing a threat they could survive by being careful. They were facing a threat they could only survive by not being there. Russia's response came on July 10th, one day before the peak strike night. The halting of all shipping through the Don Azov Channel and the suspension of all Kerch Strait passage requests. 3 industry sources confirmed the decision to Reuters. The Azov Sea, the body of water that Vladimir Putin proclaimed an internal Russian lake, sovereign and controlled, a trophy of the 2022 campaign, was closed. Not by Ukrainian warships, not by a blockade in the conventional sense, by the credible, demonstrated, and repeatedly confirmed threat that any vessel attempting to use it would be struck. Think about what that sentence actually means for a moment. And think about when you last saw a conventional naval power close an enemy's inland sea without deploying a single surface ship of its own. Put your answer in the comments, because the strategic history being made here is genuinely unusual. The economic consequences radiate outward in multiple directions simultaneously. Fuel that was moving by sea toward Crimea now has to find another route, and the only remaining route, the Kerch Bridge, was never designed to carry the full logistical load that the peninsula requires. Russia has reportedly shifted toward truck-based fuel transport across the bridge rather than rail, accepting lower throughput per crossing in exchange for reduced catastrophic risk per vehicle. A train loaded with fuel on that bridge represents a target whose successful strike could disable the crossing for months. The trucks are slower, carry less, and solve the capacity problem only partially. The fuel shortage in Crimea and in the Krasnodar region, already reported before this week's strikes, will not improve. The grain export dimension is equally significant. Russia has been harvesting grain from occupied Ukrainian territories, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, and moving it through the Kerch Strait aboard cargo vessels, entering global commodity markets through the southern export corridor. According to initial economic analysis cited by Ukrainian official sources, approximately 25% of Russia's grain export traffic moved through that corridor. European wheat futures rose as much as 4% to a 6-week high on the news of the shipping halt. Russia's loss is not only military, it is a competitor exiting a market involuntarily, at a moment when global grain prices were already sensitive. And unlike Russia, Ukraine still controls its own export infrastructure. The symmetry that Russia's wartime logistics required, selling grain to fund the war, using the sea to move both, has been broken. What makes the Azov campaign particularly consequential is not only what it has achieved, but what it has revealed about the assumptions underlying Russian maritime planning. Those vessels were out there, unescorted, because the planners who sent them had concluded that the drone threat was manageable, that the combination of distance, electronic warfare coverage, and the sheer volume of traffic would make systematic targeting difficult. That conclusion was wrong, and the evidence suggests it was not corrected as it became wrong. The strike tempo accelerated over 5 days, 8 vessels, then 9, then 14, then 12, then 28. Each night was a data point. Each data point confirmed the same finding. The response, halting traffic, came not after the first night, but after the cumulative damage had already reached catastrophic levels. 76 vessels struck before the decision was made to stop sending them. The psychological effect of that pattern on everyone watching, every maritime insurer, every shipping company operating shadow fleet vessels, every navy evaluating its surface doctrine, is not incidental. It is, arguably, the most important output of the entire campaign. Shadow fleet operators, the network of obscurely flagged and opaquely owned vessels that Russia uses to circumvent oil export sanctions, have been watching 76 of their counterparts get struck in 6 days. The financial logic of operating in Russian waters does not require a formal analysis. It requires a willingness to be next. That willingness is finite. In Moscow, the rhetorical environment has shifted in a way that Ukrainian officials and external analysts have flagged as deliberate preparation. Senior Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has begun describing the conflict not as a special military operation, but as a war. A full-scale war, defined by Russian commentary as one in which Ukraine is backed by the collective military infrastructure of Western nations. This linguistic shift matters because it is preparatory. The special military operation framing carries legal constraints within Russia. It does not easily permit martial law, mass economic mobilization, or the kind of conscription that the front lines in Donetsk now appear to demand. A war does. Russian parliamentary elections provide the next political window for a mobilization announcement, and Ukrainian military intelligence has characterized the rhetorical shift as exactly that kind of preparation. Russia is not fielding replacement soldiers fast enough through voluntary recruitment to sustain current casualty rates. The General Staff of Ukraine recorded 1 1,490 Russian personnel removed from the battlefield in a single day during this reporting period, against a replacement rate on paper of roughly 1,120 per day, and a realistic replacement rate closer to 800. The arithmetic of that gap, sustained over months, produces a manpower crisis that the special military operation framing cannot solve. Russian state media commentators, including prominent television personalities whose commentary reflects, at minimum, the anxieties circulating in official circles, have begun asking publicly where the Navy is. Why were commercial vessels unescorted? Why the Azov has effectively been conceded without a counter. These are not the questions of a side managing a difficult situation. They are the questions of a side that has lost something significant and is searching for someone to blame before the public catches up to the scale of what happened. Here is what this campaign will look like in the doctrinal literature written about it 5 or 10 years from now. A defending power with no surface navy, operating under a maritime blockade of its own coasts, neutralized an adversary's inland sea logistics corridor using a drone platform that costs a fraction of the vessels it destroyed, required no naval infrastructure to deploy, and achieved a strategic effect: the closure of an entire sea to enemy commercial and military shipping that previous generations of strategists would have considered impossible without surface or submarine forces. The Azov campaign did not happen because Ukraine got lucky or because Russia made a single catastrophic mistake. It happened because Ukraine accepted the logic of cheap, networked, scalable systems before Russia accepted the consequences of not adapting to them, and then executed that logic at increasing scale over a period of days until the cumulative damage forced a decision. Every navy that still bases its doctrine on platform mass, tonnage, and the assumption that a sea can be controlled by the largest ships on it is now looking at 76 vessels struck in 6 days by an opponent with no ships at all. The warning encoded in that fact is not aimed only at Russia. It is aimed at every defense ministry in the world that still believes the 20th century's answers will work in the 21st century's battles. The Azov campaign is not a special case. It is a demonstration. And demonstrations, unlike arguments, do not require agreement to be effective. If Russia proceeds with a new mobilization and floods the Donbass with additional manpower, does it change the underlying equation, or does it simply increase the scale of attrition without altering the dynamic that the drone campaigns have established? And if that mobilization generates the internal economic and social pressure that Russian commentators are already implicitly acknowledging, a complete disappearance of fuel was cited on state television not as a catastrophe, but as something that would only drive more men to enlist. What does political stability in Russia look like by the end of the year? Those are the questions that matter now. Not whether Ukraine can keep hitting ships, it clearly can, but whether the cumulative weight of what it is achieving is moving faster than Russia's capacity to absorb it. Leave your read on that in the comments. The people watching this from Kiev, from Warsaw, from Washington, and from Moscow are all asking the same question and reaching different answers. If this gave you something the headlines did not, share it. The algorithm rewards that more than anything else you can do, and it puts this kind of analysis in front of the people who need it. Subscribe for the next piece the moment it publishes. The story is not slowing down, and neither are we.